Hey guys, tonight we begin with something special. This is a journey into a quieter corner of the past, where stories are not loud with battles or victories, but soft with the small rituals that came before an ending. History, when told this way, has a rhythm like breathing, steady, unhurried, patient. These are not tales meant to quicken the pulse, but to still it. Before we step into tonight's story, take a moment to like this video and subscribe so that these forgotten mysteries can drift a little farther, maybe even reaching others in your family who need a gentle way to fall asleep. And in the comments, tell me your location and the exact time you're watching this. It's always fascinating to see those tiny lights glowing on a map across the world, each one of you listening quietly, together, though apart. Now let us begin. They called it a fever, though no thermometer could measure it, and no doctor could cure it. It did not come with cough or chill or rash, but with visions. Shining nuggets glowing in the mind's eye. Rivers heavy with treasure. Hillsides hiding fortune just beneath the soil. Men caught it in taverns, in crowded port cities, in the echo of a rumor carried from one tired voice to another. Women caught it when letters arrived from husbands who promised riches just a season away. Children overheard it whispered like a prayer, and they carried the heat in their imaginations, believing their family would soon live in splendor. This fever spread with frightening speed in the middle of the 19th century. It crossed oceans faster than ships themselves, for long before a vessel could reach San Francisco, the story of gold in California had already sailed ahead in words. Newspapers inked the rumor into permanence. Street pamphlets multiplied it. Letters doubled and redoubled it until the dream felt inevitable. People in cities as far away as London or Paris or Sydney began to look at their lives differently, not as steady, but as a temporary state before fortune arrived. The strange thing about this fever was that it asked nothing at first. It cost no coin to catch it, no labor to maintain it. But once it settled in, it hollowed out ordinary life. Farmers stared at their fields and saw only the monotony of soil. Shopkeepers handled coins and wondered how small they seemed compared to golden dust. Sailors heard the clinking of rigging and imagined it as the clinking of treasure. Whole communities seemed to tilt toward the west, restless and unable to stay. In villages, men began to sell their land at a fraction of its worth, believing they would buy tenfold on their return. Families pawned heirlooms, packed wagons, and left behind furniture too heavy to carry. Ships bound for California grew crowded with passengers who had never seen the sea before, their faces marked with the same expectant glow, as though the ocean itself had become a mere bridge to cross, not a danger to survive. The fever was never logical, and logic had little room against it. Reports of harsh deserts, freezing mountains, or violent seas were treated as nuisances, like gnats that could be brushed aside. When someone mentioned the difficulty of survival, listeners simply smiled, already far away in thought, already picturing their hands holding heavy yellow stones. The spark that set this fireless fever alight was simple. A discovery near a river, just pebbles glinting in water, picked up by chance. The truth of the moment was small, almost forgettable. Yet once it was spoken, once it was written, it expanded in memory. The gold became larger, purer, more plentiful with each retelling. By the time the world heard of it, it was not a modest find at all, but an endless river of riches waiting for the first who dared to reach it. It was not only men of youth and vigor who were drawn in. Old men who had never swung a pickaxe in their lives packed up with trembling hands. Scholars abandoned their books, thinking perhaps a short season of digging could free them to study forever after. Soldiers who had known the bitterness of war thought this rush would be peace, only to find it another battlefield. The fever made no distinctions. It filled cities with empty houses, left wives waiting on doorsteps, and scattered children across continents. Every port that offered passage westward became crowded. Ships that had once sailed with measured timetables now left whenever they were full. and they were always full. Some passengers climbed aboard with only the clothes they wore, trusting fortune to clothe them anew. Others carried trunks stuffed with goods, shovels, boots, pans, items that merchants assured them would make the difference between poverty and wealth. As the fever swelled, it carried with it another sickness, the belief that wealth was not just possible but certain. That certainty dulled the senses, made men reckless, and turned caution into an insult. If one man hesitated, another pushed past him, convinced that the gold would not wait. The journey began not in the mines, but in the mind. People saw gold before they ever touched it, and most never touched it at all. They saw it gleaming in their sleep, coating their hands, pouring from sacks. They saw themselves transformed into men of influence, returning home with their pockets heavy enough to change the course of their families forever. Yet the true fever lay not in gold itself, but in the distance between what was and what might be. That distance was wide enough to swallow whole lives. What no one confessed aloud was that the fever often brought with it a silence, a pause in judgment. A man who once cherished his land might leave it barren. A woman who once relied on her husband's steady work might watch him vanish toward the horizon, promising return. The fever was not merely a call toward wealth, but a release from responsibility. Gold offered not just abundance, but escape from debt, from duty, from the daily grind of labor that had always felt endless. In the taverns of eastern cities, men gathered and traced maps on rough tables, talking of trails they had never walked, rivers they had never crossed. The way west was spoken of as though it were a single road, clear and straight, instead of 100 broken paths carved through desert, mountain, and swamp. Each man nodded as if he knew the way, though few had travelled farther than the county line. Such was the nature of the fever. Confidence without ground, plans without substance. The fever was strongest in the evenings, when imaginations were most free. In the glow of lamplight, after a day of ordinary labour, men leaned back and pictured the extraordinary. They felt it almost in their hands, the heft of gold, the cool gleam of it against the skin. They thought of what they might buy, the houses they might build, the comfort they might earn for their families. They spoke of it until it became real, and once real, it could no longer be resisted. There was a quiet cruelty to the fever. It did not kill outright, but beckoned men into danger. It did not wound, but lured them into places where wounds were inevitable. It did not demand blood at once, but promised reward only after blood was spilled, after lungs coughed out dust, after backs bent beneath ceaseless labor. The fever was patient, waiting for each dreamer to exhaust himself against the hard truth of the earth. In those early days, when the first wave of seekers began to pack their belongings, neighbors often gathered to watch them go. Some cheered, imagining themselves next to follow. Others shook their heads, seeing folly in the excitement. But once the wagons rolled away, silence fell heavy, and those left behind felt the emptiness. The fever was not only contagious, it was persistent. It gnawed at those who stayed, whispering that perhaps they too should have gone. What made this fever unlike any other was its promise of fairness. It suggested that anyone, regardless of birth or wealth, could reach down and pluck fortune from the ground. A prince and a pauper, side by side in a river, both might strike gold, or so it was said. The reality was harsher, but the dream of equality burned brightly. It was democracy of desire, and in that sense, the fever carried with it the illusion of justice. As weeks became months and months became years, the fever showed no sign of waning. Ships kept arriving, wagons kept rolling, and the trails west grew thick with footsteps. Camps sprang up in valleys and along riversides, canvas cities rising almost overnight. At night, fires burned in thousands of pits, and stories rose with the smoke. Stories of men who had already struck it rich, stories that urged others to keep digging. Rarely did anyone tell of the failures, the hunger, the despair. The fever silenced those tales, for no one wished to dampen the fire in their own chest. It is difficult, from this distance, to imagine the scale of that restlessness. Entire towns thinned as men vanished into the horizon. Ships anchored in harbours were abandoned by their crews, left to rot in the water while sailors sought gold inland. Roads that had once carried steady trade now carried caravans of dreamers, their eyes fixed westward. What began as rumour became migration. What began as a handful of seekers became a tide of humanity. And yet, beneath all the movement, beneath all the noise and dust, lay the truth that the fever itself was the only certain thing. Gold might be found or not, fortunes might rise or collapse, but the fever endured, carrying people farther than they had ever imagined, into landscapes that cared nothing for their hunger. The fireless fever consumed without burning, guided without compass, promised without delivering. It was the opening note of a long and weary song, one that would carry countless lives into hardship and leave most of them emptier than when they began. And so it spread, quiet, invisible, unstoppable, shaping the first step into a journey that would prove harsher, colder, and lonelier than anyone had dared to believe. Once the fever had taken hold, it did not allow a man to sit still. It pressed against his ribs like a quiet urging, a reminder that fortune lay somewhere beyond the horizon. And so the leaving began, first in trickles, one wagon setting off down a rutted path, one ship raising anchor with too many bodies pressed against its rails, then in floods, as whole caravans stretched across the plains, as roads that had once carried farmers to market now carried families to a future none of them could see clearly. The journey west was not a single road. It was thousands of paths, broken and uncertain, winding through wilderness and desert, over ridges where wheels splintered and rivers where wagons drowned. From the eastern seaboard, travellers poured into gathering points, where trails began in earnest. Independence, St. Joseph, Council Bluffs. Towns that had been quiet frontier outposts now swelled with restless humanity, their streets crowded with on-horses, mules, and men who spoke a dozen languages but shared the same burning hope. Those towns smelled of tar, leather, sweat, and anticipation. Blacksmiths worked without pause, hammering shoes for animals and rings for wheels. Merchants shouted their wares, flour by the sack, bacon salted until it was nearly stone, beans that could last months if kept dry. Every tool was promised to be essential: shovels, picks, pans, tents, ropes. Men bought what they could carry, what they could not, and what they would later abandon on the trail when their animals staggered beneath the weight. Leaving the towns, the land itself became both guide and enemy. The grasslands rolled outward in waves, endless and deceptive, each hill promising a view of the far distance, yet revealing only more grass, more sky. Days were measured not by clocks, but by how many miles the oxen trudged before collapsing at dusk. Nights were a fragile respite, fires flickering low as coyotes howled and the cold crept in. The stars, clear and countless, gave comfort to some and unease to others, for they reminded men of how far they were from the familiar. The roads west did not forgive weakness. Shoes tore apart within weeks, hands blistered and then hardened, though not always fast enough. Children cried from thirst when waterholes proved dry, their parents staring helplessly into cracked ground. Dust coated every surface, so thick it seeped into food, into lungs, into the folds of clothing, turning everything the same dull brown. Even laughter, when it came, was muffled by the grit in the air. Caravans grew into small societies. At dawn, wagons formed into lines, stretching as far as the eye could follow. At night, they circled for safety, the shape of the wheel becoming the shape of survival. Some men argued about pace, some about routes, but most learned quickly that stubbornness could kill more surely than the wilderness. Illness moved quietly through the groups. Cholera, dysentery, fevers that did not glow with gold, but burned just the same. Graves marked with wooden crosses dotted the trails. each one a reminder that the land took as much as it gave. For all its hardships, the westward road hummed with an energy unlike anything those travelers had ever known. Every morning brought them closer to a dream, even if the dream itself remained out of sight. The roads seemed endless, but so did their determination. Men sang as they walked beside their oxen, women hummed to quiet, restless children, and the creak of wagons blended with the rhythm of thousands of footsteps. It was a music of sorts, though heavy, as if the land itself was listening. Mountains rose eventually, distant blue lines sharpening into walls of stone. To reach the gold fields, men had to climb. Wheels splintered against jagged rocks. Animals stumbled on narrow passes, and men hauled wagons by hand when the slopes proved too steep. Snow still lingered in the high places, biting at fingers and numbing feet. Many who had pictured themselves striding boldly toward fortune now found themselves crawling, gasping, straining against the weight of their own ambition. Those who took southern routes faced deserts instead. Heat shimmered on the horizon, water vanished, and men rationed sips from barrels that grew lighter with every mile. Oxen collapsed in the sand, tongues swollen, eyes glazed. The desert swallowed wagons whole, left behind like skeletons, their canvas covers flapping in hot winds. Some men swore they saw gold glinting in the mirage, only to stumble into emptiness, their voices cracking against the silence of the wasteland. Still they went on. For every man who turned back, 10 pressed forward. The fever inside them was stronger than exhaustion, stronger even than hunger. Letters home spoke of progress, rarely of pain. Families waiting in far-off towns read of bright skies and hopeful mornings, not of graves dug at dusk or wheels shattered in the mud. Hope was always written louder than hardship. The endless roads westward were not empty. They were filled with the footsteps of those who had already come and those who were yet to follow. Tracks crisscrossed, ruts deepened until they became trenches. Paths widened until the land itself seemed to sag beneath the weight of movement. Camps sprouted like temporary villages, filled with voices from across the world. Irish, German, Chinese, Chilean, all sharing fires, all chasing the same elusive promise. In those camps, news traveled faster than the wagons themselves. A man might arrive weary at dusk and hear that riches waited just weeks ahead. He would rise the next morning renewed, his body still aching, but his spirit burning. The roads had no end in sight, but every mile was believed to be the mile that mattered. Time became distorted on those roads. Days blurred into one another, sunrises identical, sunsets repeating. The march westward felt eternal, as though the road itself had no destination, only the motion of people carried forward by their own desire. Yet behind each weary step lay the same truth. To reach the gold fields meant first to survive the journey, and survival was never guaranteed. Storms tore through camps with little warning. Winds ripped canvas from wagons. Rain turned paths to rivers of mud. Lightning struck close enough to shatter trees. The roads became rivers. The rivers became traps, and still men waded through, their clothes heavy, their dreams heavier. Each step forward cost them more of themselves, but the fever urged them on, whispering that just beyond the next ridge, fortune waited. There was no silence on the roads, only the endless noise of travel, the grind of wheels, the lowing of oxen, the shouts of men urging animals onward, the cries of infants, the coughs of the sick, and beneath it all, the steady drumbeat of footsteps, thousands upon thousands, marking a migration so vast that it reshaped the land itself. The farther west they traveled, the more the wilderness closed in. Forests pressed tight around narrow trails. Rivers cut across their paths. Canyons opened without warning. The earth itself seemed determined to test each traveler, to demand proof of endurance before allowing them farther. Some passed, many did not. But those who pressed on believed the hardship only made the reward more certain. The endless roads westward were not just physical, they were roads of the mind. Every man carried with him an image of the future, a picture painted in bright strokes of wealth and ease. That image walked beside him, whispering strength when his legs trembled, pushing him when his body longed to stop. The dream became a companion, as real as the wagon he pushed or the animal he led. Yet the dream could not fill an empty stomach. It could not mend broken wheels or lift drowned wagons from riverbeds. It could not ease the cough of a child burning with fever. And so the roads westward became littered with remnants of the dream. Boots worn through to leather scraps, tools bent and useless, wagons abandoned like carcasses. Each one told the story of a family who had once believed they would survive, only to vanish into the wilderness, leaving nothing but traces behind. Still, the tide did not slow. The roads carried men and women forward in an unceasing stream, each one convinced that survival belonged to them, that fortune had chosen them, that their story would not end like the others. The land stretched on, endless and indifferent, swallowing their steps into its silence. It was here, on these roads without end, that the truth of the fever began to show itself. Gold was never waiting just beyond the next horizon. The horizon only moved farther away, carrying them deeper into hardship, deeper into exhaustion, deeper into the quiet realization that the land asked more than most could ever give. The roads westward stretched not only across the continent, but into the spirit of every traveler, a test of endurance that few truly passed. And yet, each morning, the march resumed, because turning back was unthinkable, and standing still was impossible. The endless roads had no mercy, but they had a direction, and for those caught in the fever, that direction was enough. The wagon was not a vessel of comfort, though many believed it would be when they first placed their belongings inside. It was, instead, a wooden box on wheels, a contraption built to creak and groan, to stumble forward on the strength of tired animals and stubborn men. Covered in canvas, it looked from a distance like a floating sail across the prairies, white against the endless grass. Up close, it smelled of sweat, leather, and earth, with each plank vibrating from the strain of uneven ground. Inside, space was a cruel teacher. Families stacked bags of flour and barrels of salt pork, bolts of cloth, kettles, axes, and pans, until there was barely a corner left for a child to curl into. What could not be carried on the wagon was tied to its sides, tools rattling against wheels, crates bouncing with every rut. As the miles stretched on, these excesses fell away. A broken chair left behind in the dust, a trunk emptied onto the roadside when the oxen could not bear the load, a piano abandoned in the grass that would never again sound a note. The road was littered with these small defeats, each one a reminder that the promises of preparation meant little against the stubborn weight of the land. The wheels themselves became the story of each day. Iron rims clanged against rocks, wooden spokes cracked under strain, and every traveler knew the sound of disaster, the sudden snap of a wheel breaking apart. Men fell to their knees with hammers and nails, working under the sun to repair what they could, their hands blistered, their brows dripping with sweat. A broken wagon could halt a family's future in an instant, stranding them miles from help, forcing impossible choices: leave the supplies behind or leave the dream behind. Dust followed them everywhere. It rose with the wagons at dawn, lingered at noon, and settled only when the stars came out. It coated their faces until they were unrecognizable, carved lines into their skin, and turned their hair the color of the earth. It filled their lungs, rasping with every breath, making each cough taste of soil. Children wiped their eyes until they were raw. Mothers shook blankets only to have them brown again before morning. Even water, when they found it, carried the taste of grit. In the heat, the wagons became ovens. Beneath the canvas, air barely moved, and travelers sat drenched in sweat, their throats dry, their heads throbbing. At night, the same canvas became a thin shield against the cold. Wind tore through the seams, rattled the boards, and left sleepers curled tightly together, shivering as coyotes cried in the dark. The wagon gave no real shelter, only the illusion of it, Yet still families clung to its wooden frame as though it were a lifeline. Promises were everywhere along the trail. Merchants had promised that these wagons were strong enough for any journey, that tools sold in eastern towns would carry a man to fortune, that sacks of flour and bacon would last the entire way. Guides swore that rivers could be crossed with ease, that mountains were only minor inconveniences, that the desert could be outpaced if one simply rose early and pressed hard. Each promise cracked as easily as a wagon wheel. Each one fell into the dust, trampled by footsteps that believed the next promise would be true. The greatest promise was always that of speed. Leaflets spoke of reaching California in weeks, but weeks became months, and months stretched into seasons. Men who thought they would be sifting gold by summer were still trudging through plains in autumn. Winter caught more than a few, and the snows showed no mercy. Wagons froze in place, animals starved, and men stared at the white horizon with despair. The promise of fortune ahead became the bitter truth of survival in the present. Even those who kept moving discovered the roads were not equal. Some stretches offered firm ground. Others collapsed into swamps that swallowed wheels whole. Axles sank into mud, requiring dozens of hands to haul them free. Men's boots disappeared into the muck, their bodies trembling with the strain. Hours were lost to pulling, shoving, cursing, praying, until finally the wagon groaned forward, only to be met by another pit a mile ahead. Dust storms were worse still. Winds rose without warning, sweeping the plains with such force that the sky disappeared. The canvas covers flapped like sails in a storm, ropes snapped, and wagons tilted under the assault. Men tied scarves around their mouths and eyes. Children were buried in the folds of their mothers' skirts, and animals stumbled blindly. When the winds passed, the land was changed. Camps buried, tracks erased, belongings scattered miles away. Promises of safe passage felt hollow against such power. The roads brought more than hardship, they brought doubt. Families who had spoken confidently of their future now whispered in the dark about whether they had been foolish to begin. Husbands stared at their wives with guilt. Wives stared at their husbands with blame. And children listened in silence, clutching dolls made of rags, sensing that the golden dream was not as close as their parents had once said. The wagons rattled forward, but the silence inside them deepened with every mile. At river crossings, the promises of safety unraveled further. Men had been told the wagons would float if sealed, that oxen could swim with the current, that ropes would guide them across. Yet rivers swept families away. Wagons tipped and spilled their contents into rushing water. Barrels, blankets, tools, all gone in an instant. Some swam to shore, gasping and broken. Others vanished beneath the surface, their names carved into no stone, remembered only by the trembling survivors who watched the water close over them. And yet, despite it all, the road continued to pull them forward. The dust, the rattling wagons, the broken promises, all were swallowed by the same fever that had set them out in the first place. For every voice that muttered of despair, another rose with determination. A man would point to the horizon, swearing that the land ahead was kinder, that the worst was behind them, that fortune was waiting. The wagons moved again, creaking like tired bones, dust swirling behind them like ghosts of those who had fallen. Merchants had spoken too, of wealth hidden in the very wagons themselves. Goods carried west could be sold at high prices in the camps, they said. Some believed them. Wagons were filled with extra shovels, kettles, boots, blankets, all meant for trade. But when the journey grew unbearable, those goods were discarded to lighten the load. By the time families reached the far side of the plains, many wagons carried little more than bones of wood and a scattering of dreams. The trade goods had become scattered offerings to the road, left behind for strangers who would never see the owners' faces. Dust did more than choke lungs. It erased the details of those who walked through it. Faces lost their sharpness, clothes became uniform shades of brown, and men who had once been distinguished by their professions became indistinguishable travelers, all hunched in the same weary posture. The dust was a great equalizer, reminding each man that wealth was not yet his, that survival itself was the only measure for now. The endless clatter of wagons filled the days, a wooden heartbeat that never ceased. At night, when the wheels stilled, silence pressed down heavy. Fires crackled low, voices spoke in hushed tones, and the stars stretched overhead, indifferent to the movement below. The wagons stood in circles, shadows against the prairie, monuments not of triumph but of endurance. They promised safety, but gave only a fragile illusion. They carried men westward, but at a cost greater than any had imagined. Every rut in the road, every splintered wheel, every sack of flour emptied too soon told the same story. Promises had been made, and promises had been broken. Yet the wagons pressed on, carving tracks that would scar the land for generations. And behind them, in the drifting clouds of dust, lay the truth of the gold rush. Not the glitter of fortune, but the weary footsteps of those who learned too late that the road itself was the harshest test of all. The road west was long, and every turn seemed to hold the promise of an ending that never quite arrived. The travelers who pressed on through the choking dust and hollow echoes of wagon wheels carried in their minds an image brighter than any reality could deliver. They had dreamed of a place where rivers gleamed with flakes of gold, where fortunes lay in shallow pans, waiting to be scooped like kernels of corn spilled across a floor. But what met their eyes when the hills gave way to valleys marked with tents and makeshift shelters was not the picture carried in newspaper drawings or whispered around firesides in distant towns. The mining camps were something else entirely, a fragile collection of lives clustered together in the raw skeleton of a world that had been imagined far grander than it ever was. Approaching one of these settlements, a traveler would first notice the smoke. It did not rise cleanly into the sky like chimney smoke from a settled town, but hung low, mingled with the dust of churned soil and the sharp scent of burning wood. Campfires dotted the uneven ground, each one ringed with men crouching over meager meals, bowls balanced on knees, their faces hollow from the strain of long days with pick and pan. There were no orderly streets, no neat rows of houses, no civic pride. The camps looked less like towns and more like sudden eruptions. Patches of canvas tents, log lean-tos, and rough shanties nailed together out of whatever scraps of lumber could be found. The sound carried before the sight, hammering on tin, the rasp of saws, shouts exchanged between men whose nerves had been rubbed thin by the closeness of others. The music of ambition had quickly turned into the clamour of desperation. Laughter, when it came, was sharp and brief, ringing out like broken glass before being swallowed by the steady undertone of coughing, arguing, and the dull thud of tools in earth. It was not the noise of a place being built to last. It was the unsettled murmur of something temporary, like a storm cloud that gathered but never quite broke. When a man set foot in such a camp for the first time, he would often stand still, letting the sight sink into him with a heaviness he had not prepared for. The stories that had driven him westward had promised opportunity, but here was the truth laid bare. A scattering of men from every corner of the world, huddled together without structure, without comfort, each one chasing the same thin hope. A canvas tent might house 3 or 4 men who had never met before their journey began, their lives now tangled together by necessity. Inside, the air was damp with sweat and smoke, the ground littered with boots, blankets, and the constant presence of hunger. Water ran near some camps, and it was there the men spent their days, bent over creeks, trousers soaked at the knees, hands raw from cold and mud. They sifted endlessly for glimmers of gold. The first sight of them was sobering. There were no triumphant cries of discovery, no sudden fortunes spilling into waiting hands. There was instead silence, broken only by the scrape of pans, the shuffle of boots in gravel, and the occasional curse when a rock cut too sharply, or when yet another day passed with nothing to show for the labour but calloused hands. For newcomers, the camp revealed something even more unsettling. There was no welcome committee, no system of order, no guidance for the weary traveller who had spent months in reaching this place. Each man was on his own. Food was bought at outrageous prices from those who had managed to haul supplies farther west. and even then, it was often spoiled or meager. Salt pork so stiff it had to be boiled before eating, flour alive with insects, beans cooked until they were barely palatable. A man might hand over half of his savings just to keep himself from starving, and still the meals filled his belly only halfway. Disease was a constant companion. The first glimpse of the camp streets, or what passed for streets, showed muddy lanes streaked with waste. With no proper sanitation, sickness spread quickly. A cough in the night became a fever by morning, and by evening it could carry a man off before he had even dug his first pan of dirt. Graves sat at the edges of the camps, hastily dug, marked with little more than wooden boards or piles of stone. Travelers who entered the camp for the first time could not help but notice them, though most turned their eyes away, pretending not to see. The social fabric of the camps was as rough as the ground beneath them. Men outnumbered women by an overwhelming margin, and the absence of families gave the settlements a restless, rootless air. Gambling tables and drinking tents sprang up as quickly as any shelter, often better supplied than the miners' cabins. A man who could not find gold could still lose what little he had in cards or whiskey, and many did. Brawls broke out over cheating, over women, over nothing at all. Knives and pistols were as common as shovels, and justice, when it appeared, was swift and uncertain, handed out by those who happened to be present rather than by any official authority. The first sight of the mining camps was not only a vision of struggle, but also of strange energy. For all their hardships, the camps pulsed with a peculiar kind of hope, stretched thin but not entirely extinguished. Every man believed, at least for a time, that his fortune might be found tomorrow, or the next day, or the day after that. It was this fragile belief that kept them bent over their pans, that made them endure the endless mud and smoke, that allowed them to keep breathing in the sour air of the camp when every instinct told them to flee. At night, the camps glowed with small fires, men huddled in close, their conversations low, their faces drawn into sharp relief by flickering light. Some sang softly, songs from Ireland, from China, from the southern states, voices blending into a patchwork of accents and memories. Others sat in silence, staring into the flames, their thoughts wandering back to the homes they had left behind. The night sounds carried across the valley, the coughing, the muttered prayers, the restless turning in blankets too thin to ward off the chill. It was not the silence of peace, but the silence of exhaustion, broken only by the occasional gunshot or shout when tempers flared even in darkness. The impression left on any newcomer was inescapable. This was not a place where survival came easily. The camps promised opportunity but delivered hardship at every turn. The reality was that only a handful of men would ever find enough gold to change their lives, and the rest would spend their years in this limbo of mud and smoke, waiting for a chance that never arrived. The first glimpse of the mining camps stripped away illusions, leaving in their place a sobering awareness of the cost of chasing dreams across a continent. It was here, among the tents and fires, that the myth of the gold rush began to crack. What seemed from afar like a story of wealth was, up close, a story of endurance. And for those who stepped into that world for the first time, the realization was both immediate and irreversible. Survival here was not guaranteed, and fortune was always just a little farther away than one could reach. When the sun slipped behind the jagged ridges, the mining camps changed in character. The rough energy of the day, filled with shouting and the relentless clatter of picks against stone, gave way to something quieter, yet no less heavy. Darkness did not bring rest in any true sense. It merely shifted the weight of hardship into another form. A man stepping back from the diggings as the light faded would return to his shelter not with relief, but with the grim knowledge that the night carried its own burdens. Shelter was never what the word implied. The tents scattered across the camps were thin walls of canvas, stretched across wooden frames, flapping restlessly in the evening winds. Inside, the air was close, damp from the breaths of too many men crammed into a space too small. Blankets, if a man had them, were rough and worn, spread over ground that was uneven and often still wet from the day's rain. The nights beneath those fragile roofs were long, each hour marked not by sleep, but by the sounds of a camp that never truly grew quiet. Canvas could not keep out the chill. The California nights, especially in the early years of the rush, were colder than many had expected. Travelers who had come from cities, who had read about golden sunshine in the newspapers, had not prepared for the sharp edge of the mountain winds that cut through the valleys. As the stars appeared overhead, bright and distant, men lay in their tents shivering, their teeth clenched against the cold. Some burned candles or lanterns until the fuel was gone, hoping the small flame might trick the air into gentleness. But canvas was no match for the night sky, and warmth was always fleeting. Sleep itself was a rare commodity. Tents were not places of rest, but of noise and movement. A man's neighbor might cough endlessly, hacking from the dust that clogged his lungs. Another might turn in his blanket over and over, muttering in dreams or calling out the names of distant wives and children. Rats moved freely in the darkness, rustling through sacks of flour and gnawing on boots left carelessly near the entrance. Dogs barked at shadows, horses stamped their hooves, and the thin walls of the canvas let in every sound. For those lying inside, the night stretched into long hours of half sleep, where dreams and waking thoughts tangled together until morning blurred into exhaustion. Beyond the tents, the campfires glowed against the blackness, circles of orange light where men gathered to delay their return to the cold ground. The smoke curled into the air, carrying with it the smells of beans cooking, of coffee boiled too long, of whiskey passed from hand to hand. Around those fires, songs sometimes rose. Irish ballads, frontier tunes, verses in languages many did not understand. The voices wove together in a strange harmony, a reminder that the camp was built from men scattered across continents, all of them here for the same elusive promise. Yet even these songs carried a note of weariness, the words trailing off as fatigue pressed in. There was little privacy in the nights beneath thin canvas skies. Every man's sorrow, every restless stirring, was shared by those close enough to hear it. Stories were told quietly in the dark, of fortunes just waiting in the next valley, of families who would one day be reunited, of ships waiting in San Francisco Bay to carry gold back across the ocean. These stories filled the hours when sleep refused to come, and for a brief moment they gave shape to the endless waiting. But once the voices fell silent, the reality of the night returned, sharp and undeniable. Illness showed itself most cruelly at night. Fevers rose as the chill deepened, sweat soaking into thin blankets, the sound of ragged breathing carrying through the camp. A man who coughed in the morning might be buried by the next dusk, his tent already claimed by another desperate soul. The thin canvas offered no barrier against contagion, and so the nights became a breeding ground for sickness, passed from one bunk to the next, until whole rows of tents carried the same rasping chorus. The gravediggers, too, worked by firelight when they had to, lowering bodies into the earth while others tried to close their ears against the scrape of shovels in dirt. The stars themselves became both comfort and torment. A man lying on his back, staring through the flap of his tent, might trace the constellations he had known as a boy. They were the same in California as they had been in New England, in Ireland, in China, but their familiarity carried with it a sharp ache, a reminder of home, of warmth, of places where night did not feel like a test of endurance. Letters written by lantern light often began in these hours, scrawled in uneven hands on paper creased and dirt-stained. They carried across oceans the truth of these nights, the loneliness, the hunger, the cold. Many letters never reached their destinations, but still they were written, as if the act itself might keep a man tethered to the world he had left behind. There was danger too, in the darkness. Camps that appeared sluggish by day could turn violent by night. Whiskey loosened tongues and tempers, and disputes over claims or gambling debts were often settled in shadows. A man stepping outside his tent to relieve himself might hear the sudden crack of a pistol, followed by shouts and the hurried rush of boots. The canvas walls did nothing to muffle these bursts of violence. Sleep, for those who managed to find it, was always shallow, ready to be broken by a noise too sharp, a silence too sudden. And yet, despite the misery, the nights carried their own strange rhythm. They stitched the days together, one to the next, with their mixture of restlessness and despair. A man might survive a day of labor with pick and pan, but it was the night that tested his spirit. Beneath the thin canvas, he learned the weight of his own endurance, the limits of his patience, the depth of his longing for something more than cold ground and restless sleep. The camp, seen at night from a distance, looked almost peaceful. Dots of firelight scattered across a valley, flickering beneath a sky heavy with stars. To the traveler on the road, it might have seemed inviting, a promise of warmth and company after miles of emptiness. But up close, within the tents themselves, the truth was harsher. The canvas roofs let in the cold, the damp, the fear, and the endless chorus of human need. When morning finally came, it was not greeted with joy, but with relief. The canvas flaps opened to the pale light of dawn, and men stumbled out with eyes ringed in shadow, their bodies aching from another night half spent in waking. They rose because they had to, because the search for gold would not wait, but the memory of the night lingered with them, carried into the day like a shadow that stretched long and thin. The nights beneath thin canvas skies revealed more than the harshness of the gold rush. They revealed its fragility. The dream of fortune had drawn thousands into the mountains, but it was under those frail tents that the truth settled in. Survival here was not only about the dirt and the rivers. It was about enduring the hours when the world was stripped bare, when hope lay silent, and when even the stars above seemed to watch with indifference. The dream of gold had always seemed simple enough. Dig, sift, and collect the shining fragments that waited patiently beneath the earth. But the reality that unfolded in the camps was far less forgiving. The pursuit of fortune was not just a battle against rivers and soil, but against the very objects in a miner's hands. The picks, shovels, pans, and cradles that wore out faster than the bodies wielding them. The sight of broken tools piled in corners of camps told its own story. Here, the very instruments meant to unlock wealth were as fragile as the hopes they carried. A man's first possession in the diggings was often a pan, a shallow dish of tin or iron, bought at a steep price from merchants who knew desperation when they saw it. These pans were never built to last. After weeks of scraping against gravel, the metal bent, edges warped, bottoms thinned until water leaked through the smallest cracks. A miner might squat for hours in the creek, swirling mud and stones, only to watch as his pan finally gave way, the thin sheen of gold dust slipping back into the current with the rest of the dirt. It was a cruel irony. Tools were supposed to create fortune, but more often they devoured it. Shovels fared no better. Their wooden handles split after too many strikes against stone, their iron blades dulled to uselessness in a matter of days. Few men carried spares. Most patched what they had with strips of leather, lengths of rope, or nails hammered in hastily. A broken shovel meant hours wasted, hands forced to dig in soil with nothing more than fingers and rocks. Some improvised new handles from crooked branches, the awkward shapes cutting into palms until blisters swelled and split. Each swing became slower, weaker, the tool itself an enemy as much as a companion. The pickaxe, a symbol of labor in every sketch and story of the gold rush, carried its own betrayals. Forged iron tips cracked when struck against boulders too hard to yield. The handles, like those of shovels, weakened with each blow, until the sudden snap sent splinters across the miner's face. When such breaks happened, men cursed the wasted hours, but they rarely paused. They tied the pieces together, binding them with rawhide or wire, forcing another day's use from what should have been discarded. In this way, the camps became museums of patched, twisted tools, each one scarred by the futility of work that consumed more strength than it rewarded, More elaborate contraptions, the rocker, the sluice box, the long tom, promised efficiency but delivered disappointment. Built from rough timber scavenged nearby, they leaked, sagged, or collapsed under their own weight. The miner who spent days constructing one often discovered that it captured little more gold than a simple pan, and sometimes none at all. Hours of carpentry, aching shoulders and raw hands ended with muddy water seeping through loose seams. Many walked away from their contraptions in frustration, leaving them to rot on riverbanks. Monuments to ambition turned sour. The merchants who sold tools knew this cycle well. They had no interest in durability. Their profit lay in fragility. A pan that lasted a week was worth far more than one that endured a season, for it guaranteed another sale, and then another. Prices were raised shamelessly. $10 for a shovel that cost less than one back east. $20 for a pickaxe barely hardened. Men paid because they had no choice. To arrive in camp without tools was to starve, and to arrive with tools meant only that starvation would take longer to arrive. In the nights around the campfires, conversations often turned to tools. Men compared the weaknesses of their pans, the weight of their shovels, the hours lost to breakage. Some swore by certain blacksmiths, names passed along like secrets, as if sturdier metal might change the course of fate. Others cursed every merchant in San Francisco, claiming the gold was not in the rivers, but in the pockets of those who sold picks and pans. The bitter laughter that followed such words was always short-lived, for no complaint could change the reality that the work demanded tools, and tools were destined to betray. Hands bore the marks of this struggle as plainly as the ground bore the scars of digging. Fingers curled stiff from gripping wood rubbed smooth by sweat. Calluses split open, blood mingling with dirt, only to harden again into rough patches that never healed. Splinters festered, nails cracked, knuckles swelled. A miner's body broke down in rhythm with his tools, as if man and object shared the same fragile lifespan. Each day began with hope and ended with exhaustion, the cycle measured not in gold dust collected, but in shovels chipped, pans bent, and picks splintered. The cruelest truth was that most tools never earned back the price paid for them. A man might spend his savings on a set of implements, only to discover that his claim held little more than mud and stones. By the time his shovel snapped and his pan leaked, he had found nothing but disappointment. The tools that had promised riches left him poorer than before, burdened with debts to merchants who knew better than to chase fortune in rivers when they could harvest it from dreamers. Some miners attempted to forge their own tools in crude blacksmith setups within the camps. Fires were built high, iron scraps hammered on rocks in the dim light. The results were heavy, misshapen, and barely functional, but they carried with them a sense of control that the store-bought implements never did. Still, these too broke, bent, or rusted in the damp nights, leaving their makers as weary as those who had spent their last coin in town. Every broken tool told a story of futility. They littered the ground around abandoned claims, left behind by men who could no longer bear the labor. Handles stuck up from the earth like gravestones, blades rusted to reddish dust. Travelers passing through such places could read the truth in those fragments more clearly than in any newspaper. This was a land where the tools gave out long before fortune gave in. The gold rush was a theatre of endless effort, but its props, the pans, picks, and shovels, were built to collapse. They betrayed their owners not with sudden treachery, but with steady erosion, a wearing away that mirrored the hopes of the men who held them. By the time a miner looked at the jagged remains of his last shovel, he often recognized what he had refused to admit before. The dream itself had always been more fragile than the wood and iron in his hands. And so the camps lived in a cycle of renewal and ruin, each day beginning with the sound of picks striking rock and ending with tools splintering in weary hands. In that cycle lay the quiet truth of the gold rush, that the promise of wealth was less about what the earth yielded and more about what it consumed. The men came seeking gold, but the first thing they lost was not their strength or their health, but but the very tools that carried their hope. The rivers of the gold rush carried promises that rarely belonged to reality. They shimmered under the sun, broad and cold, their surfaces rippling as if hiding something precious just below. Men came to them with dreams of wealth, yet they discovered something else entirely. Water that numbed their bones, mud that swallowed their tools, and long days that ended with empty bellies. If the rivers gave anything, it was more hunger than gold. In the beginning, the newcomers did not notice it. They arrived with the excitement of fortune, their shovels and pans slung over their shoulders, their thoughts filled with images of nuggets waiting to be scooped out of the earth. The riverbeds sparkled in their imagination, but when the first days of digging ended, their pans held more sand than anything else. Tiny specks of color might cling to the edges, but those fragments were so light that even the breeze could carry them away. What remained was disappointment, and worse, exhaustion. The act of panning was far more draining than the hopeful advertisements ever explained. A man had to stoop for hours, knees sunk in cold water, back bent toward the current, hands swirling dirt and stone until his fingers went stiff. Each pan was filled with gravel, swirled in circles, washed, then inspected with a desperate eye. And each time, the promise dwindled. A few flakes of dust worth less than a loaf of bread, nothing more. The body, however, had already spent itself. Arms trembling, stomach growling. Rivers ran wide through California and the mountain territories, but not all were kind. The season mattered too. Spring floods swept away camps. Summer droughts left mud that baked into stone. Winter brought ice-cold water that cut through boots and numbed flesh until men could no longer feel their toes. A day in the river was not just work. It was a battle against nature. And unlike gold, hunger never failed to show itself. By nightfall, men sat by their fires, gnawing on stale bread or beans boiled until the skins split, wondering how much longer they could last on food that seemed to shrink with each week. What made the hunger sharper was the simple imbalance between effort and reward. A miner might spend 12 hours in the water, soaking, straining, sifting, yet finish with barely enough gold dust to buy a single meal in town. Food in the goldfields was never cheap. A sack of flour cost as much as a miner earned in days. Eggs, when they could be found, sold for absurd prices. Meat was a luxury, and often it was stringy or spoiled from travel. Salt pork and beans became the staple, but even that tasted like ash after months without variety. The rivers did not forgive mistakes either. Many miners lost their pans, their shovels, even their boots to the current. A sudden slip, a surge of water, and the tools were gone, swallowed by the mud. Without them, a man had nothing. Replacements cost dearly in supply towns, where merchants charged whatever they pleased, knowing desperate men would pay. And so hunger deepened, not only from food, but from the knowledge that each setback pulled a man further away from the fortune he had imagined. There were stories whispered by the firesides of men who struck it rich in an hour, pulling out nuggets the size of walnuts. Those tales kept others in the water, their bodies shaking with cold, their eyes fixed on the swirling pan as though a miracle might appear at any moment. But for most, the miracle never came. The rivers seemed to mock them. For every flake of gold, there were mountains of stone, endless gravel, mud that clung to boots and weighed down every step. Hunger became a companion. It gnawed at the stomach during the day, then sharpened at night. The camps filled with the smell of weak stews, beans stretched thin, coffee boiled so many times it tasted like burnt water. Some miners resorted to foraging. They searched the banks for berries, though many seasons yielded little. They tried to hunt small animals, rabbits, squirrels, but even those grew scarce, frightened away by the endless noise of digging and shouting. A lucky man might catch a fish, yet the rivers themselves seemed reluctant to share. The streams that promised wealth gave out meager meals, barely enough to sustain the endless labor. The irony was bitter. Men were surrounded by flowing water, but much of it was unfit to drink. Upstream camps and sluices muddied the currents with silt and waste. Animals drowned in the water, their bodies drifting unseen until sickness spread downstream. Dysentery became common, stomachs twisting not from hunger alone, but from the foulness of what little they consumed. To drink the river was to gamble. Some boiled it, though fuel for fires was precious. Others drank it as it was, praying they would not pay the price. By the second or third year of the rush, hunger had become the truest measure of the rivers. Merchants prospered while miners grew gaunt. Supply wagons trudged into camp loaded with goods, their drivers knowing well that flour, sugar, and beans brought more profit than gold dust. It was said a man selling eggs could grow richer than one sifting gravel. And in many cases, it was true. The rivers provided illusions, while the merchants provided survival. But hunger did not only dwell in the stomach, it lodged in the mind. The endless searching, the aching failure, the sight of others finding even the smallest success while one's own pan stayed empty. This bred a hunger of the spirit, a yearning for something that never came. It hollowed men out. They stared into the water with a dullness that no amount of sunlight could lift, their hands moving in circles without hope, only habit. For some, hunger drove them away. Camps emptied as men abandoned their claims, choosing to return east or drift towards cities where at least steady meals might be found. Others trudged on, unwilling to surrender to defeat. They became shadows by the riverside, their bodies shrinking, their faces lined before their years. The promise of gold lingered, but so did the certainty of hunger. The rivers, in the end, gave more stories of starvation than triumph. They carried no concern for the men who knelt in them. They flowed as they always had, cold, steady, indifferent. The dreams of fortune seekers dissolved in their currents, leaving behind the reality of ribs showing through thin shirts, of men too weak to lift a shovel, of camps where silence grew heavier than the clatter of pans. And still the rivers glittered under the sun, as though mocking the men who had come so far. The hunger they spread was not loud or dramatic. It was slow, creeping, a dull ache that wore down body and mind alike. In the gold rush, the rivers promised wealth but delivered emptiness. A miner's stomach, after a long day in the water, was the truest reflection of that bargain. Hunger never stayed at the riverside. It followed men back to their camps, settling into their bellies like an unwelcome tenant that refused to leave. If the riverbeds failed to yield enough gold dust, the markets and supply tents in nearby towns finished the job of wearing men down. There they discovered that food was not simply nourishment. It was a measure of survival, and often a cruel reminder that the dream of fortune was slipping further away. Bread and salted meat became symbols of that reality, not because they were luxurious, but because they were nearly impossible to afford. The cost of food during the rush did not obey the logic of farms or fields. It obeyed the law of distance. Everything a miner ate had to be hauled across mountains, deserts, and rough trails, pulled by wagons or carried by pack animals that staggered under their burdens. The further one traveled from established farms and ports, the heavier the price became. A single loaf of bread, which in a city might be purchased for a few pennies, could cost the weight of a day's hard labor in the gold country. Flour, the base of survival, was treated as though it were treasure in its own right. Men who dreamed of nuggets found themselves instead measuring their success by the handful of flour they could afford. A sack of it might cost more than their week's findings. To eat bread in such a place was not a common comfort. It was an event. Many miners stretched flour thin, mixing it with river water and ashes from the fire to make flat cakes tough as leather. Still, it was better than nothing, and each bite was swallowed with the awareness that tomorrow's supply might vanish. Salted meat followed the same rule. Packed in barrels, shipped overland, it arrived grey and stiff, often with a smell that turned stomachs before the first bite. Yet it was precious because it was filling. Salt preserved it, but it also burned tongues and dried throats. Miners ate it anyway, chewing on it like rope, forcing it down because hunger allowed no pride. A slice of salted pork might last a man through a day, but only if he was disciplined enough to ration it. Many were not, and they paid with nights of gnawing emptiness. The merchants knew this better than anyone. In the goldfields, they became the true winners of fortune. They brought wagons filled with flour, beans, salt pork, coffee, sugar, and sold them at prices that would have been laughable anywhere else. But here, where men's lives depended on those goods, there was nothing to laugh at. A merchant could name his price, and miners would pay. Gold dust, that elusive prize of the rivers, passed more readily into the hands of storekeepers than into the pockets of miners themselves. There are records of single eggs sold for $1, of a pound of butter costing more than a miner earned in half a day. Yet it was not extravagance, it was necessity. Even poor food was better than none. And every miner knew that without sustenance, there was no chance of striking gold. The body gave out long before luck arrived. Hunger bent the back, dulled the eyes, and eventually forced a man to leave. Those who could afford bread and meat, no matter how plain, had the strength to continue. Those who could not withered until the dream dissolved into weakness. In the camps, meals became strange parodies of home. A pot of beans simmered endlessly, each day stretched thinner with water, the taste fading until it was more memory than flavor. Bread was treasured, but it was often coarse and gritty, baked with sand or dirt that found its way into the flour during transport. Teeth cracked on the hardness of it, yet no one wasted a crumb. The salted meat, boiled to soften it, filled the air with an acrid smell that clung to clothing. Still, when night fell and fires flickered, miners ate in silence, their chewing steady, their minds fixed on survival. It was not just the price of food that cut deep, but the way it shifted the balance of life. Men had traveled thousands of miles, chasing visions of wealth, only to realize that they were spending the very gold they sought on the bare minimum to live. For many, each ounce of dust earned by the rivers was exchanged immediately for bread, beans, or meat that disappeared within hours. The fortune they hoped for dissolved into daily meals, leaving nothing to send home, nothing to build upon. The absence of vegetables and fresh produce added another quiet misery. Scurvy crept into the camps, gums swelling, teeth loosening, bodies aching with a fatigue that no amount of rest cured. The salted pork and dry bread filled stomachs, but they offered little else. Miners grew gaunt, their faces pale, their bodies stiff. Some died not from accidents, not from violence, but from the slow starvation of the body's deeper needs. And still, bread and salted meat remained the only choices, expensive and unsatisfying, yet impossible to live without. Occasionally, a man would strike lucky and buy a rare treat, perhaps a piece of fresh fruit carried in from the coast, or a cut of real beef slaughtered nearby. Such moments became stories told around campfires, as though the taste of an apple or the tenderness of fresh meat was a treasure greater than gold. They reminded the men of the world they had left behind, a world where food was ordinary, where bread was just bread and not the dividing line between strength and collapse. But these were exceptions. Most days followed the same rhythm. Work until hunger hollowed you out, then eat what could be afforded, no matter how meager. Sleep came with the weight of emptiness, and morning returned to the same routine. It was a cycle that stripped away illusions. Gold might glitter in dreams, but in the waking hours, survival depended on bread hard as stone and meat salted until it resembled nothing natural. As months passed, some grew bitter. They realized that the true wealth of the rush lay not in the rivers, but in the supply chains. The ranchers who drove cattle, the merchants who sold flour, the traders who carried salted pork, they prospered. The miners, bent over pans and shovels, found themselves poor in body and in spirit. Bread and salted meat marked the cruel exchange, gold for survival, fortune for sustenance. The price of food told its own story. It spoke of isolation, of how far the camps lay from fertile soil and ordinary markets. It spoke of desperation, of how men valued a crust of bread as much as a nugget. And it spoke of the quiet failure of so many who came to the goldfields, not knowing that their greatest struggle would not be with the rivers, but with their own hunger. In the end, the cost of bread and salted meat was not only measured in gold dust, it was measured in the weariness of bodies, in the cracked teeth, in the hollow eyes of men who sat by dim fires, chewing food that never seemed to satisfy. The gold rush promised riches beyond imagining, but for most, the reality was simpler and far crueler. To endure another day, one had to pay dearly for bread and meat that barely kept life going. The hunger that gnawed at miners' bellies did not vanish when they left their camps for the towns. If anything, it deepened, shaped not only by empty stomachs but by the sight of streets where every surface seemed worn thin by desperation. Towns in the gold country were not cities in the sense most had known back home. They were hastily assembled, built not for comfort, but for commerce. Hammered together from rough boards and canvas, each building leaning as though it might collapse in the next hard rain. Yet these makeshift streets filled quickly, not with wealth, but with crowds of men who looked like shadows of themselves. Rain was not frequent, but when it came, it turned the ground into a sucking mire. The streets, lacking cobblestones or proper drainage, became rivers of mud thick enough to swallow boots whole. Men trudged through it, their legs caked, their clothes heavy with filth. The wheels of wagons cut deep ruts that filled with brown water, and every step was a reminder that this land was not designed for so many bodies pressed together. Horses stumbled, carts toppled, and more than one man found himself stuck fast, pulled free only by the hands of strangers. The mud became the true owner of the streets, swallowing all who dared to pass. With mud came the smell. The air carried the stench of unwashed bodies, spoiled food, and the waste of animals and men alike. There was little order and less sanitation. Buckets of refuse were tossed into alleys, where they mixed with the rain and seeped back into the streets. Flies swarmed, and sickness lingered in every corner. The towns swelled with people faster than they could build, and the result was a place where disease spread silently, hidden within the crowds. The crowds themselves were a sight to behold. Men from every corner of the world pressed shoulder to shoulder, their faces drawn, their clothes patched and torn. Some carried shovels and pans, others little more than empty sacks. They came with hope, but the streets revealed how little hope was worth. Many had already failed at the rivers, their hands blistered and empty, and now they wandered through town, searching for work that was scarce or food they could barely afford. The noise of voices filled the air, languages mingling, accents colliding, all of it blending into a constant murmur of longing and frustration. Gambling dens and saloons lined the muddy streets, their doors open at all hours, offering distraction to men who had nothing else to spend their gold dust on. Inside, the air was thick with smoke, the floors sticky with spilled liquor, and the promise of fortune no more real than it was in the rivers. Cards slapped against tables, dice rattled across wood, and with each roll, men lost what little they had earned. Outside, fights broke out easily, fueled by liquor and disappointment. Knives flashed, fists flew, and sometimes bodies were left behind in the mud until morning. Merchants, too, filled these streets, their stalls packed with goods that glittered far brighter than the hopes of the miners. Tools, clothing, food, and luxuries that no one truly needed, all sold at prices higher than any sane man would pay, yet still they sold. Gold dust passed hand to hand, exchanged for bread, for boots, for a moment of comfort. The merchants grew fat, while the miners grew thin, and the crowded streets made the contrast impossible to ignore. For many, despair came not in a sudden crash, but in a slow realization, carried on the sight of those streets. They saw men who had once arrived with the same fire in their eyes, now broken, their shoulders slumped, their pockets empty. They saw sickness walking openly, faces pale, lips cracked, bodies coughing as though the very air was poison. They saw men sprawled drunk in the mud, their fortunes lost to cards and drink, and they saw the merchants counting dust behind their stalls, the only steady winners in this game of survival. Women, too, appeared in these towns, though in smaller numbers. Some came with families, trying to carve out a life by running inns or cooking meals. Others arrived alone, and survival pushed them into harder trades, offering companionship in the shadows of the saloons. For them, the crowded streets carried another weight, the constant eyes of men who had not seen home or softness in months. Safety was scarce, and despair settled heavily on their shoulders too. Children were rare, yet not absent. A handful of families dragged their young west, chasing the same promise of wealth. For a child, the crowded streets were both playground and peril. They ran barefoot through mud, laughing, while sickness waited nearby. They carried water, sold newspapers, begged for coins, and grew old too quickly under the weight of survival. Their presence was a reminder that the gold rush was not only the story of men, but of entire households uprooted and reshaped by the fever for wealth. Nightfall brought no peace. If anything, it deepened the despair. Lanterns flickered weakly, casting more shadow than light, while the streets filled with the clamour of saloons, the shouts of gamblers, the wail of fiddles played out of tune. The mud turned cold, the air sharp, and the town seemed to sink under its own weight. Men stumbled home drunk, their boots dragging through the muck, their pockets lighter than when they had entered. The unlucky curled up in doorways, their faces pressed into their arms, the night offering no more comfort than the day. Some tried to make sense of it, to find patterns in the chaos. They told themselves the streets were only temporary, that fortune still waited just beyond the horizon, that tomorrow might bring a better turn of luck. Yet the streets told a different story. They whispered of failure, of hunger, of the truth that most would never leave richer than they arrived. They pressed that truth into every pair of boots caked in mud, every cough that echoed through alleys, every fight that spilled blood into the dirt. The despair was not loud or dramatic. It was quiet, steady, like the flow of a river eroding stone. It seeped into the bones of those who walked the streets, turning their steps slower, their shoulders heavier. It showed in the way eyes no longer lifted to meet one another, in the silence that settled when a man collapsed and no one rushed to help. It showed in the way the merchants grew richer and the miners grew older, their bodies giving out long before their dreams did. The gold rush promised adventure, fortune, and freedom. The crowded streets revealed the cost of chasing it. They were not paved with riches but choked with mud, filled not with triumph but with struggle. For every man who found his nugget, there were hundreds lost to hunger, to sickness, to despair. And as the streets swelled with bodies, the truth became impossible to ignore. Survival in the gold country was not about strength or luck. It was about enduring mud, hunger, and the quiet erosion of hope. The mud did not dry quickly. It clung long after boots left the streets, carried into tents, inns, and cabins, where it hardened into crust and filled the air with a damp, earthy smell. When the rains gave way to colder winds, the same streets that once swallowed feet turned brittle with frost. Nights grew longer, and the thin canvas walls or rough-hewn boards that served as shelter offered little defense. In such conditions, the body became fragile, and sickness waited patiently for its chance. Cold in the gold country was not like the sharp bite of winter in towns where fires roared in brick hearths and blankets piled high on beds. Here, it was thinner, quieter, more insidious. It slipped through seams in the canvas, curled beneath blankets, and settled deep in bones. A miner could lie beside a fire and still feel it on his skin, as though the night itself pressed its weight upon him. Breath froze in the air, beards stiffened with frost, and fingers ached even before tools touched them. Each dawn was a battle not against gold or rivers, but against the chill that seeped into marrow. The body weakened quickly. Hands cracked until blood seeped from split knuckles, making even the simplest task painful. Feet, constantly damp from the mud, blistered and froze, leading to infections that festered without proper care. Coughs echoed through the camps, at first small and scattered, then steady as a chorus. What began as shivers often ended as fever, and with fever came the unmistakable shadow of sickness. Illness travelled with ease in such places. Camps crowded men together, tents pitched close for warmth, air thick with smoke from damp wood fires. Each cough spread further, each sneeze carried on the draft that slipped between canvas seams. Fevers came suddenly, leaving men drenched in sweat by night and shivering by morning. Some could not rise again once sickness set in. They lay on their blankets, eyes glazed, their bodies too weak to continue. Medicine was scarce, and doctors scarcer still. A handful of apothecaries set up in towns, their shelves lined with bottles of powders and tinctures, but most offered little more than alcohol, laudanum, or herbs that dulled pain without curing the cause. Quinine was precious, but rare. Opium soothed coughs, but it dulled the will to fight. The sick often depended not on medicine, but on luck, and luck was as fleeting here as gold itself. The cold worsened what hunger had already begun. Men whose bodies were hollow from thin meals lacked the strength to withstand fever. Their skin hung loose, their ribs pressed sharp, and when sickness took hold, it consumed them quickly. Pneumonia was common, filling lungs with fluid until each breath rattled like gravel in a pan. Dysentery thrived in the filth of overcrowded camps, draining bodies already too weak to resist. Malaria, carried from swamps and stagnant pools, left men trembling in fits that wrung them dry of energy. The weight of sickness was not felt only in the body, but in the spirit. To hear coughing from every corner of the camp, to watch friends grow pale and weak, to bury men in shallow graves when the ground was too frozen to dig deep, it pressed down on all who remained. Hope, already thin, cracked under the strain. Men arrived seeking gold, but many found only illness that followed them like a shadow. Those who did not fall sick often lived in fear that they soon would. Each chill, each ache in the bones, carried the suspicion that it was the beginning. A miner might rise one morning with a sore throat, and by night be coughing blood into the dirt. No one knew who would endure and who would falter. The uncertainty was its own torment, turning each cough from a neighbor into a reminder of how fragile the body truly was. Some tried to fight the cold with layers of clothing, though most had little more than what they had carried west. Wool was scarce, and blankets wore thin quickly. Fires offered temporary relief, but fuel was limited, and damp wood smoked more than it burned. Nights often ended with men huddled together, their bodies pressed close not from camaraderie, but from the desperate need for warmth. In the silence of those nights, broken only by the crackle of weak flames and the hacking of sick men, the cold seemed endless. There was a cruelty to how illness spared no one. The strong fell as easily as the weak, the young as quickly as the old. Fortune at the rivers did not grant protection. Gold dust in a pouch could not stop fever from burning through a body. Merchants, gamblers, miners, even doctors themselves, all felt the weight of it eventually. The camps that once buzzed with ambition grew quieter, punctuated by the sound of coughing, the shuffle of boots carrying bodies to burial. Yet life did not stop. Even as sickness spread, men continued to rise at dawn, shovels and pans in hand, driven by the thought that maybe today the river would yield enough to make it all worthwhile. Work carried on with aching bones, with fevers half hidden, with lungs too weak to draw a full breath. To stop was to accept defeat, and many refused until their bodies gave them no choice. The sight of men collapsing in the rivers, their tools slipping from numb hands, was common, and each collapse carried the unspoken truth. Survival here was not promised. In the towns, sickness took on another shape. Hospitals of canvas and wood sprang up, crowded with cots, their air thick with the smell of sweat, blood, and burning herbs. Nurses and doctors worked tirelessly, but there was little they could do. The sick lay shoulder to shoulder, their moans blending with prayers, their futures uncertain. Outside, the streets continued their chaos, but within those makeshift walls, the true cost of the gold rush revealed itself. The cold, indifferent and steady, made each day harder. It weighed down clothes, slowed hands, clouded minds. It stripped away the last defenses against sickness, leaving the body open to whatever ailment struck next. Survival meant not just finding food or earning enough to pay for shelter, but enduring the relentless press of chill air and the illnesses that followed in its wake. By spring, when the ice thawed and the mud returned, many were gone. Graves dotted hillsides, marked only by rough wooden crosses or stones piled hastily. The names of the dead often vanished with them, remembered by few, if at all. What remained was the memory of the weight, the way the cold pressed against skin. the way sickness spread through camps like a tide that could not be held back. The gold rush had promised riches beyond imagining, yet for countless men, it delivered something else entirely. The quiet, suffocating heaviness of illness in a land too harsh to forgive. The rivers might sparkle in daylight, but beneath thin blankets at night, surrounded by coughing, shivering bodies, the truth was unavoidable. The weight of cold and sickness was heavier than any shovel of dirt, heavier than any dream of gold. The tents that sprouted along the riverbanks were meant to symbolize beginnings. They were supposed to be temporary shelters, flimsy fabrics stretched over poles, patched with scraps of canvas or stitched together from old sails. For those who carried them across miles of dirt and stone, they were imagined as small refugees, thin-walled promises of safety after days of toil. But in truth, they were no stronger than paper in a storm, and no barrier against what waited when the campfires burned low. At night, the goldfields did not rest. By day, a miner might spend every ounce of strength turning over mud and gravel, straining his back and blistering his palms in the hope of seeing a single glittering flake. But after sundown, hunger, desperation, and envy stirred awake. Shadows lengthened across the camp, and within those shadows men remembered that not all fortunes were found by bending to the river. Some were taken by hand, by knife, by fist. The thin walls of canvas did not muffle footsteps. They did not stop a drunken brawl from spilling into the narrow lanes of the camp. They did not keep thieves from cutting their way into another man's meager belongings. A tent, no matter how carefully pitched, offered only the illusion of privacy. At any moment, the flap could be torn open, and what little one had, tools, boots, a pan, a pouch with a few grains of gold, might vanish before the dawn. Violence was not always loud. Sometimes it was a shadow slipping between the tents, quiet as a fox, taking what hunger demanded and vanishing into the blackness of the trees. Sometimes it was a pair of figures wrestling in silence, one desperate to protect his claim, the other desperate enough to risk everything. And other times, it was sudden, a thunderclap of rage echoing down the rows of shelters, a curse shouted in a dozen languages, a fist breaking against bone, the glint of steel catching the firelight. Law traveled slowly to these places. The camps grew faster than courts could form, faster than sheriffs could be sworn in, faster than rules could be agreed upon. In their absence, men invented their own law. Sometimes that meant an informal committee of miners deciding disputes at sunrise, their verdicts enforced by threat of exile. Other times it meant nothing more than the law of the strongest, the man with the heaviest pick, the loudest voice, or the most companions at his back. To be weak was to invite harm, and to be strong was to live always with the danger of being challenged. Alcohol deepened the dangers. Casks of cheap whiskey arrived on muleback or by wagon, selling for prices that seemed absurd but were paid without hesitation. Miners drank until the dirt beneath their boots spun, until grief and exhaustion slipped into a blur, until restraint dissolved. Then quarrels that began with laughter and boasts hardened into insults. Insults became shoves, and shoves ended with blood spilled in the mud. In the morning, the camp might find a body lying in the trampled ground between two tents, covered only with a torn blanket. The gamble of survival was not always about chance encounters in the night. Some men carried grudges. A claim disputed, a tool borrowed and not returned. A rumor spread about a pouch of gold dust hidden under a bedroll. Such things lingered like embers waiting for dry kindling. Days later, they could flare up, the violence burning hotter than any campfire. Those who came from distant shores, Chinese laborers, Mexican vaqueros, men from Chile, Peru, or the Caribbean, faced more than ordinary danger. They were marked by their accents, their clothing, their customs. In the eyes of others, that difference alone was reason enough for scorn, or for worse. Harassment turned to attacks, and in some places entire groups were driven from their tents by mobs of jealous miners, convinced that the gold belonged only to them. To walk the camp at night as an outsider meant to carry the constant weight of fear, knowing that shadows held more than thieves, They held hostility sharpened into cruelty. Even those who thought themselves safe, men who had companions, men who had armed themselves, men who had claimed spots close to others, found that the shadows were never loyal. The friend who shared a tent might also share too much whiskey, and in his stupor decide that his comrade was hiding gold. The neighbor who lent a tool one day might, the next night, demand it back with violence. To trust was necessary, yet to trust was also to invite betrayal. The tents bore witness to these struggles. Canvas walls became stained, not only with the smoke of fires and the grit of dust storms, but with the marks of fights fought within them. A cut across the fabric told of a theft. A sagging pole hinted at a scuffle that left no one standing. A tent standing alone at sunrise, flap untied and belongings scattered, suggested a miner who would not return. There was little room for justice. When a man disappeared, others shrugged. Perhaps he had moved on. Perhaps he had gone deeper into the hills. Perhaps he had been swallowed by the river. Few asked questions, for to ask was to invite them upon oneself. Survival demanded silence, and silence made the violence all the more easy to repeat. The nights dragged on in this way, a cycle of suspicion and fear. Every creak of canvas in the wind might be an intruder. Every crunch of gravel might be a footstep meant to rob or to kill. The men who lay awake, staring at the dark folds above them, knew that no dream of gold could shield them when the thin walls gave way. They clutched their pans and knives, slept with their boots still on, and woke at the slightest sound. Rest was never complete. Even in sleep, the body braced itself for the shock of intrusion. By day, the camp looked much the same as any frontier village. Rows of tents, smoke rising from fires, men bent over tools. But by night, it was a different world. A theatre of shadows, where desperation was rehearsed endlessly, always with the same ending. The promise of fortune had drawn them here, but the darkness reminded them that fortune was fragile, easily stolen, easily destroyed. Those who managed to endure did so not because the tents were safe, nor because justice prevailed, but because they accepted the constant risk as part of life. They learned to live within it, to keep their possessions close, to form uneasy alliances, to drink less or to drink more, depending on which numbed the fear better. The violence did not stop. It simply became another feature of the nights, as ordinary as the cry of an owl or the rush of the river. The thin canvas shelters had been carried across deserts and mountains with hope, but beneath their flaps, men discovered that the hardest storms were not always of wind or rain. They were storms of envy, hunger, anger, and despair, storms that rose from human hearts and filled the shadows with danger. In those moments, the gold rush revealed itself not as a land of opportunity, but as a place where survival was measured in vigilance, where the night was never truly silent, and where the faint rustle outside one's tent might be the last sound ever heard. The men who arrived in the diggings came with grand images in their minds, dreams painted in gold, as if every stone along the riverbank would glisten, every pan would deliver a fortune. They had crossed oceans, deserts, mountains, endured weeks of hunger, mud, fever, and exhaustion, believing their reward was waiting just beneath the soil. But as weeks stretched into months, the earth gave up little more than silt and disappointment. Those who had once spoken proudly of ambition began to measure their lives in smaller terms. A meal, a place to sleep, the warmth of fire on a cold morning. When fortune failed to appear, hunger took its place. The dream of wealth did not vanish, but it twisted, taking on darker shapes. Men who once bent their backs honestly to the current began to glance at their neighbors' pans. They saw not only mud and water, but the faint glint of something they had failed to capture themselves. And slowly, the line between miner and thief blurred. It often began with whispers. A man who had worked a claim all day, who had rinsed his gravel over and over, might finally see a few bright flecks sink into his pan. By evening, as he carried his pouch back to camp, word would spread. Perhaps he had been careless and boasted loud in the tavern. Perhaps someone had simply seen the way he held the pouch, tight against his chest, and guessed its worth. In a place where hundreds of men dug side by side with empty hands, such knowledge was dangerous. Once night fell, shadows followed him. At first it might be small, the sudden loss of tools left by the tent, a pan carried off, a blanket stolen. These things could be chalked up to bad luck or to carelessness, but often it did not stop there. A miner who seemed to have struck even a modest patch of luck would find himself watched more closely than he realized. And eventually, if his gold seemed too real, too steady, someone else would decide that fortune could be taken faster than it could be dug from the earth. The thieves were not always strangers. Sometimes they were the very companions who had traveled west together, sharing the same fires, splitting the same hard bread. Hunger tested friendship, and gold tested it further. A man who had once guarded another's back might one day vanish into the night, carrying his partner's pouch of dust. By morning, all that remained would be footprints leading away from camp, fading into the hills. In some places, thievery grew so common it became an expected part of life. Men sewed their small findings into the seams of their clothes, hid them in hollowed-out handles of tools, or buried them beneath the floor of their tents. Some tied pouches around their necks, sleeping with them pressed to their chests. Yet even then, safety was never certain. A careless moment, a single heavy drink, a night of sleep too deep, and the treasure would be gone. Not every theft was silent. There were ambushes along lonely trails, where one miner returning from a supply town with flour or salted pork might be set upon by 2 or 3 desperate men. In the quiet of the woods, violence came suddenly. A cry for help vanished into the trees, leaving only an abandoned pack or an overturned cart. By the time others found the scene, there was nothing left to do but shake their heads, for pursuit was useless in a land so wide. Theft also wore clever disguises. Claim jumping became one of the most common forms. A man might leave his spot for a day, traveling to town for supplies or to seek medicine, only to return and find strangers already working it, their shovels striking into the gravel as though they had owned it from the start. Arguments rose quickly, but without law to settle disputes. Strength or numbers usually decided who remained. The unlucky miner, no matter how much time he had already invested, might be forced to walk away empty-handed, watching another man sift the earth he had once called his own. Supplies, too, became targets. Food was as valuable as gold, and often more immediately necessary. Sacks of flour disappeared from tents. Salt pork was cut away in the night. Beans and coffee vanished like smoke. In towns, merchants locked their stores tight, yet break-ins became inevitable. A loaf of bread stolen from a shelf might mean another day alive for the thief, and perhaps nothing at all for the man who had lost it, except anger and suspicion that hardened into hatred. The greatest irony was that many of the thieves had begun as miners themselves. They had come with the same hopes, carried the same pans, stood in the same icy waters. But after days of finding nothing, after watching their strength fade and their supplies dwindle, they chose another path. Some justified it as survival. Others grew addicted to the idea that stealing was quicker, that fortune could finally be within reach if they only had the nerve to take it. And in a land where law was scarce, the only punishment was what the crowd was willing to enforce. Punishments, when they came, were harsh. A thief caught red-handed might be tied to a tree, beaten or whipped. In some camps, the miners gathered to form their own rough justice, holding hasty trials and delivering verdicts that ended with exile or worse. Lynchings were not unknown. Yet for every thief caught, there were many more who slipped away, carrying their stolen goods into the hills, ready to vanish into another camp where no one knew their name. As the goldfields grew more crowded, suspicion poisoned the air. Every miner looked at his neighbor differently, wondering whether the man beside him might turn thief when hunger grew too sharp. Men grew secretive, covering their pans quickly, hiding their faces when they found even the smallest flake. Companionship gave way to watchfulness. Camps that once rang with laughter grew quieter, each man guarding himself not only against the wilderness, but against the desperation of those who shared it with him. In time, the distinction between hunter and thief blurred so thoroughly that it became difficult to know which was which. A miner who claimed success one week might vanish with stolen goods the next. A thief who slipped away from a camp might return months later, posing again as a fortune hunter, blending in with the endless tide of new arrivals. The cycle repeated itself endlessly, men arriving with hope, failing to strike it rich, and eventually turning to take from others what the earth refused to give them. The story of the gold rush is often told with shining nuggets and triumphant discoveries, but for most, it was a story of disappointment that bled into desperation. In that desperation, honesty gave way to theft, friendship gave way to betrayal, and the camps filled with men who had come to seek fortune, but found only the shadow of it in their neighbors' pouches. The tents, the rivers, the muddy streets, all bore witness to a truth few wanted to admit, that survival in the goldfields often meant stealing what someone else had fought to keep. And so the dream eroded, reshaped by hunger and violence until it was barely recognizable. The men who had once called themselves miners, fortune hunters, seekers of opportunity, found themselves crouched in the shadows, watching another man's hand tremble as he poured his day's work into a pouch. And as the darkness thickened, they convinced themselves of one final thing, that survival was worth any theft, any betrayal, any crime committed beneath the thin veil of the canvas skies. The mining camps that had begun as loose gatherings of tents and fires soon swelled into something larger, not quite cities, yet no longer wilderness. They became chaotic settlements that seemed to rise overnight, each one stitched together from timber, canvas, and desperation. Wooden shacks leaned against one another like drunks on an unsteady street. Roofs of tin or raw planks rattled in the wind. Walls cracked and warped by rain. Mud sucked at boots, pooling in every hollow, while above it all, a constant din echoed. Shouts, laughter, curses, the hammering of tools, the rattle of wagons. The promise of gold had created not only miners but merchants, gamblers, barkeepers, and all those who knew how to profit from men who believed fortune lay within their reach. Streets filled with stalls selling everything from pickaxes to boots to bottles of cheap whiskey, their prices swollen by scarcity and greed. Bread that had once cost pennies now demanded whole dollars. A shovel, nothing more than a strip of wood and iron, might cost as much as a week's wages. Those who came to dig for gold soon found that their earnings, when they had them, drained away into the hands of others before nightfall. Noise became the lifeblood of these towns. At every hour of the day, voices rose above one another, competing for attention. Hawkers shouted their prices, gamblers called for players, drunks bellowed songs that stumbled as clumsily as their feet. Fiddles screeched in taverns, boots stamped across warped floorboards, and in the narrow alleys fists slammed into flesh as arguments flared. Sleep was scarce, for even when night descended, the racket never ceased. Candlelight glowed from saloons long past midnight, spilling onto dirt streets where shadows moved restlessly, searching for trouble or simply trying to forget the hunger that gnawed at them. The stench was as constant as the noise. With so many men crowded into so small a place, with so little thought given to waste, the air grew heavy with rot. Buckets of refuse spilled into the gutters, mingling with horse manure and mud. Meat spoiled quickly in the heat, and fish gutted in the open sun left their reek clinging to the wind. Unwashed bodies pressed together in taverns, sweat soaking wool and leather, until the very walls seemed to exhale the sourness of breath and ale. Flies thickened in clouds, feeding on scraps, buzzing around faces, landing on lips and eyes with casual cruelty. Disease followed closely behind. Dysentery swept through the camps, carried by fouled water and careless waste. Men staggered to the edge of town, collapsing into mud, too weak to rise again. Fevers burned, Chills shook the strongest bodies until they could no longer hold a pick. The noise of the town carried on regardless, barely pausing for the groans of the sick. Death became another ordinary presence, a shadow seen often enough that it ceased to surprise. Shallow graves dotted the hills, marked by nothing more than wooden boards, if they were marked at all. Despite the filth and sickness, the towns grew restless with energy. They were places built, not on order, but on chance, where fortunes could change in the span of a card game or a single lucky strike. Men who had never held more than a few coins in their lives suddenly found themselves with pockets full of gold dust, and they spent it with a wildness that bordered on madness. Whiskey flowed in torrents, card tables overflowed with wagers, brothels filled with men willing to trade tomorrow's bread for an hour of warmth. Within weeks, riches were squandered, leaving only debts, and the cycle began again. Violence pulsed through these settlements like a second heartbeat. Arguments flared over the smallest slights. A glance held too long, a word spoken too sharply. Knives flashed in alleys, pistols cracked in crowded saloons. The thin walls of shacks shook with the force of fights inside them, spilling their occupants into the streets where bystanders either joined in or stepped aside. Blood soaked into dirt so often that the earth itself seemed to drink it as casually as rain. Few men carried gold without also carrying a weapon, and fewer still trusted their neighbors not to use theirs. Women were scarce, and their presence shaped the towns in peculiar ways. A single woman might walk into a saloon and silence every voice, eyes following her with hunger that was not always born of desire, but often of loneliness and longing. Many were drawn west, not for mining, but for profit, running boarding houses, selling food, or working in places that promised company for a price. Their labor, too, was consumed by the fever of the rush, their days filled with washing clothes, cooking meals, or serving drinks to men who forgot their manners along with their money. In a world where so much felt temporary, women gave the illusion of something familiar, even if only for an evening. The buildings themselves betrayed the fleeting nature of the gold rush. Few were built to last. Rough timber nailed together without care, walls warped by rain, roofs patched with tarred cloth, all stood as symbols of a place made in haste, without thought for tomorrow. Streets widened only as wagons demanded, alleys formed by accident, drains dug shallow and already clogged. These towns grew like weeds, fast, sprawling, tangled, and like weeds, they withered just as quickly when fortune faded. Yet for all their decay, they thrummed with a peculiar vitality. A man walking down the main street could feel as though the entire world pressed in around him, each voice pulling at his attention, each hand reaching for his coin. There was no silence, no stillness, no moment to breathe. And in that endless noise, the promise of gold was both amplified and mocked. For even as men shouted of fortune, most knew in their hearts that they were sinking deeper into hunger and debt. The towns became traps as much as sanctuaries. Men who had once sworn they would only stay a week or a month found themselves still there years later, their pockets empty, their tools broken, their youth wasted. Leaving seemed harder than staying. To return home without wealth was to admit failure. And so they lingered, caught in the hum of rot and noise, telling themselves that one more day, one more pan, one more game of cards might finally turn fortune in their favor. Behind the saloons and shops, in the narrow alleys choked with refuse, the truth lay bare. These towns were not built on gold, but on desperation. Every nail hammered into timber, every bottle of whiskey poured, every song shouted into the night was another attempt to drown out that truth. The noise was a mask, the rot its foundation, and together they formed the strange, unsettling rhythm of life in the goldfields. For those who dreamed of riches, this was the place where the dream was consumed. Not in the rivers, not in the hills, but in the crowded streets where hope was bartered for bread, where laughter was swallowed by the stink of waste, and where the sound of fortune was not the ring of gold, but the clatter of dice and the groans of men who had lost more than they could ever afford to give. In the end, The towns stood as monuments to the reality of the rush. Loud, filthy, restless, and fleeting. A man might have imagined he was walking into a new life, but more often he was walking into a maze of noise and decay from which few ever found their way out. By the time the first frost settled on the edges of the mining camps, the dream that had lured thousands across oceans and mountains was already beginning to wither. Gold, the word that once sparked fire in men's eyes, had started to dull, weighed down not by its scarcity alone, but by the toll of unending labor. What was imagined as glittering nuggets plucked from the earth with ease became, instead, a rhythm of backbreaking repetition. Shovel, sift, pan, and strain, hour after hour, day after day. Each motion carried the faint promise of fortune, but more often it delivered nothing but blisters, aching muscles, and disappointment so thick it clung to a man's skin like dust. The streams, once rushing with clarity, now carried the residue of endless digging. Mud churned where water once sang. The sound of shovels striking stone drowned out birdsong, and the metallic clink of pans rattled against rocks until it seemed the whole valley had been turned into a single hollow percussion. The land bore scars, banks gouged open, hillsides collapsed, and soil stripped bare. With each shovelful, the wilderness that had drawn them began to erode into a wasteland of dirt and noise, and with it, the fragile dream of riches that had shimmered so brightly in the imagination of the hopeful began to erode as well. There was a cruel truth in the rhythm of mining. The more a man dug, the more he realized that luck, not effort, dictated his fate. For every story of sudden wealth, there were hundreds more of empty pans. It became a pattern of disappointment stitched into the days. A prospector might rise with the faint light of dawn, his body stiff from a night on damp ground, and he would kneel by the water with his pan, certain that today would be different. Yet as the sun traced its slow arc overhead and shadows lengthened into evening, he would often find himself staring at nothing but sand and gravel, as though the river mocked his persistence. Food tasted of dirt too, for every meal was prepared with hands still caked in soil. Bread grew stale before the week was done, and beans boiled endlessly in blackened pots until their texture turned to paste. The air itself seemed flavored by smoke, dust, and sweat, seeping into clothes, into blankets, into the very skin of those who lived by the river. Even when men lay down to sleep, they carried the day with them, aching shoulders, raw palms, and the bitter tang of futility lodged in their throats. There were those who tried to convince themselves that fortune lingered just beyond the next bend in the river or beneath the next layer of earth. They told stories around campfires of men who had struck it rich by refusing to give up, their voices thin against the crackling wood. But the flames illuminated hollow eyes, and the silences between those stories spoke louder than words. The truth weighed heavier with each passing week. For most, the dream was slipping further away, buried under the very soil they sifted. Some abandoned the rivers altogether, retreating into the towns that had sprung up like fungi after rain. These settlements, once imagined as havens of community and progress, became strange repositories of dashed hopes. Saloons overflowed with men trying to drown disappointment at the bottom of a glass, while boarding houses filled with the sound of coughing and restless shifting in beds too narrow to stretch out in. Streets, churned into mud by wagon wheels, swallowed boots up to the ankle. Yet even here, the rhythm of shovels and pans echoed in memory, a phantom sound that haunted men as they tried to forget. The dream had not vanished entirely. It lingered like a mirage on the horizon, but it no longer shone with the brilliance it once had. Instead, it flickered faintly, fading with each new hardship, each day of labor that yielded nothing. For some, the weight of it became unbearable. Tools were abandoned by the water's edge, shovels left rusting against rocks, pans overturned in the mud. Men simply walked away, their footsteps lost in the dust of trails leading anywhere but back to the diggings. They sought work in towns, on farms, or on the endless tracks of railroads. exchanging the uncertain promise of gold for the certainty of wages, however meager. But even for those who stayed, stubborn in their pursuit, the dream continued to thin. The body could only endure so much. Hands cracked open in the cold, nails blackened and tore, backs bent permanently from the ceaseless stooping. The eyes, once bright with anticipation, dulled into a vacant stare that measured days not in progress but in survival. Sleep offered no escape. It brought only the same fatigue, stretched into morning. The rivers themselves began to grow hostile. Silt clogged channels that once ran clear, and debris from upstream choked the current. Men waded in, their boots sinking into muck, their balance precarious against shifting stones. Accidents became common. Ankles twisted, arms gashed open on sharp rocks, bodies swept away by sudden surges of water. The land took its toll in silence, indifferent to the dreams buried within it. What gold remained was scattered and small, grains caught in crevices, flakes so thin they clung more like dust than treasure. To gather them required patience beyond reason, and every panful seemed to mock the effort with its meager yield. Some men carried small vials of these specks, swirling them in the light as if to reassure themselves that the dream was still alive. Yet even as they stared at the faint shimmer within the glass, the weight of disappointment pressed down harder. They had traveled so far, sacrificed so much, and still the vial remained nearly empty. The dream faded not in a sudden collapse, but in the slow, grinding erosion of hope. Like the banks of the river wearing away under the weight of constant digging, the hearts of men were stripped of their shine, leaving only exhaustion. Each shovelful of dirt did not bring them closer to fortune. It carried them further into despair. The very act of labor, once filled with promise, became a reminder of how far the dream had drifted. In time, the camps themselves began to thin. Tents collapsed into the earth. Fires burned less frequently, and the noise that had once filled the valleys quieted. Silence grew in the spaces where once there had been the clatter of ambition. What remained were scattered figures still bent over their pans, unwilling or unable to let go, their bodies gaunt, their faces hollow. They had become ghosts of their own desires, haunting the rivers with the motions of a life that had promised more than it delivered. And in the quiet of those valleys, the lesson of the gold rush whispered softly, almost kindly. It was not shouted, not carved in stone, but carried gently in the air. The earth does not give its riches easily, and dreams built upon glitter fade quickly when pressed against the weight of reality. The dream had not died. It never truly does, but it had thinned into a fragile thread, a wisp of hope that trembled with each breath of wind. And as the last shovels struck the dirt, their sound echoed not with promise, but with futility, fading into the silence that comes when ambition exhausts itself against the unyielding patience of the earth. When the last echoes of shovels and pans faded from the valleys, the land settled into a quiet that felt older than memory. What had once been alive with voices, with the clang of tools, with the hollow laughter of men convincing themselves that fortune still lingered, became a hushed landscape of abandoned scars. The earth, patient and indifferent, took back its rhythm. Grasses crept into the shallow trenches where men had gouged the soil. Streams resumed their steady song, muffled only by the silt left behind. The great fever of gold that had shaken the hills and drawn thousands across oceans left little behind but silence. There was an emptiness to these places that struck deeper than loneliness. Towns that had grown overnight shrank almost as quickly, their skeletons left behind as reminders of ambition's fragility. Wooden storefronts leaned under the weight of neglect, their signs faded, their windows broken or boarded. Streets that once churned with boots and wagon wheels dissolved into weeds, their outlines fading into the earth as though the town itself had been a dream. The air hung heavy with the absence of sound, and what little remained was carried by the wind. The creak of a shutter, the faint groan of a roof beam collapsing under its own decay. For those who returned years later, the transformation was startling. They found not the bustling camps and raucous saloons of memory, but hollow shells. A barroom where glasses once clinked might now hold only dust and the tracks of small animals. Beds where exhausted men, once collapsed in their boots, sagged into piles of straw and splinters. Even the smell of smoke, once so constant that it clung to every coat and blanket, had vanished, leaving only the faint sweetness of rot and wild growth. It was as if the land itself had chosen to erase the noise, to sweep away the frenzy and leave behind the stillness it had known before. The silence carried with it a truth that few wanted to face. For all the digging, for all the endless shovels of dirt, vast stretches of land had never held the riches that had been promised. Rivers that were panned until their beds turned to muck yielded little more than sand. Hillsides stripped bare of trees and carved into wounds held no hidden veins of wealth. The dream had been built not on certainty, but on whispers, on stories retold around campfires, on rumors carried by men eager to sell supplies or plots of land. And when the dust settled, many realized they had labored not at the door of fortune, but in places where the gold had never been at all. This absence weighed more heavily than failure. Failure could be blamed on bad luck or on another man striking it rich just beyond reach. But to know that the ground had been barren from the start was to recognize the futility of every blister, every ache, every sleepless night. It was to see that ambition had been poured into emptiness, that faith had been spent on soil that had nothing to give. The silence of these places was not simply the absence of noise. It was the echo of futility, the sound of nothingness revealed. Nature crept back with quiet persistence. Saplings rooted in soil disturbed by pick and pan, their green shoots rising where once only men bent in endless labor. Birds returned to sing where the clash of metal had drowned them out. Animals ventured cautiously into the ruins of camps, sniffing at the remnants of meals long abandoned. In time, even the scars of mining softened, the raw cuts blurred by grass and moss, the waste piles weathered into low hills. Yet beneath that renewal lay a stillness that felt different, as though the land itself remembered what had been done and chose to grow around it without truly forgetting. There were stories of wanderers stumbling upon these abandoned places, pausing to rest in the shell of a saloon or to drink from a stream once muddied by countless hands. They spoke of the strange quiet, how it pressed upon the mind, how it made footsteps sound too loud, how it seemed to ask the question no one wanted to answer. What had it all been for? The gold that had been sought so desperately was gone, or perhaps had never been there, and the silence that replaced it seemed to mock the fever that had once filled the air. Some found beauty in it. They described the way moonlight fell on the broken timbers of cabins, how the wind whispered through gaps in the walls, how stars seemed brighter when framed by the skeletal outlines of abandoned towns. But beauty could not disguise the weight of futility. Beneath the calm surface, the silence carried the memory of hunger, of labor without reward, of dreams that withered into dust. It was a silence born of exhaustion, a silence where ambition had burned itself out. For the men who had left, the memory of these places lingered like a shadow. Even in distant cities, even in new lives built far from rivers and hills, the thought would return. The sound of a shovel striking stone, the shimmer of the fool's gold in a pan, the endless hope that tomorrow would be different. And then the silence, pressing down like a reminder that the earth had given nothing. To those who had lived it, the quiet was not peace, but an echo of futility, a weight that followed them long after they had left the camps behind. In the end, the silence of the goldless places may have been more honest than the noise that preceded it. For the frenzy had been built on illusion, on promises whispered louder than truth. When the noise died away, what remained was reality. A vast land that had never promised riches, that had never cared for the ambitions of men, that simply endured. The silence was not cruel. It was simply indifferent, as the earth had always been. And so the story of the gold rush in those valleys and hills settled not into triumph but into quiet. The silence where the gold had never been became its own monument, not carved in stone, not written in books, but carried in the air, in the stillness, in the ruins left behind. It spoke not of fortune found, but of dreams spent and forgotten, of men who gave their strength to soil that held nothing for them. It was the silence of futility, of ambition fading into the patience of the earth, where the gold had never been. The campfire has long burned down to ash, and the noise of the goldfields has slipped into memory. What remains is the faint echo of hunger, the sting of cold, and the sound of picks striking stone where gold was never found. We have walked together through streets of mud, through tents where sickness and violence waited in the dark, through markets where bread cost more than dreams, and through rivers that gave more despair than fortune. Each step of the journey showed not just the promise of riches, but the weight of exhaustion, the silence of failure, and the truth of lives that were broken before they ever struck gold. And now, as the lanterns dim and the story grows still, I leave you with a quiet thought. Would you have endured such hunger, such loneliness, such endless labor for a handful of dust that slipped too easily through tired fingers? The gold rush was never a treasure waiting to be taken. It was a trial that few survived, and even fewer conquered. If these long shadows of history kept you company tonight, I invite you to join me again when the world is quiet and the past is waiting. Let me know what part of this weary road through the gold rush stayed with you most. The cold nights, the broken tools, the streets of noise, or the silence of empty rivers. Your thoughts, like these stories, carry further than you might imagine. And if you wish to wander through more of history's forgotten corners, where the noise is into stillness and the past whispers its lessons, then stay close. Subscribe to this channel and let the sleepless hours find their way back to you through stories such as these. Until then, rest easy. The search for gold is over.